Good morning. We are at the Freiburg New Church Assembly. It's the second week of our session. This is Thursday, August 11th. I'm Gardner Perry. The title of my talk is Ezekiel's Vision of the Throne, a view from first century Judaism and its relevance for us today. So it's wonderful to be here with you. It's a privilege. It's a great honor. I'm going to start you off with a vision of the throne, which I read from Ezekiel chapter 1 on Sunday evening's chapel service. And I'm going to say just how that is in a visual representation for you to have in your mind at the moment as I say it. You need not hold the vision in your mind, but it is relevant to the talk this morning. So Ezekiel is a priest in the temple 3 years before the fall of Jerusalem at the hands of armies from the east, and it was a dire time. He then was exiled and lived as a captive among the captives, and along the river Chebar, while he was captive, and I'll say the vision as I recall it for your benefit, the heavens opened, and there was as if there was a whirlwind with flashing colors that filled the heavens in his view. And he saw first creatures, 4 of them, but the whole image was one like a human being. And the creatures, this one like a human being, had great wings, and when they flapped, there was a thunderous sound and great wind that overtook him, and bright, translucent colors. And soon he looked up, and he saw that there was something like a throne in the middle of it, and on the throne, or kind of within this, was again one like a human being. And as the wings were flapping, he saw, with great wind, he saw tremendous wheels, awesome wheels that caused him to fall back, and wheels within wheels within wheels, and on the rims of all the wheels, they were full of eyes. Horrified, he kept looking and looking, and then he heard a voice of this one like a human being, and he fell upon his face, ready to hear the word of God. And in the midst of this was bright colors like a rainbow. Okay, that's how I'm starting. That's your vision of this throne. So this vision of Ezekiel at this time. Breathtaking as it is, this scene elaborates visions that we find throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, with Moses on Mount Sinai, Elijah taken up into the heaven in a chariot, and Isaiah's vision of the temple. We find God's throne in the heavens. In this talk, I will briefly say something about that text as expressed something about that vision as expressed in the text. I will then move on to a surmise, an informed surmise that Ezekiel's vision could have been a contemplative practice utilized by the Lord while he lived in the world, whom I will call Jesus of Nazareth. That is, Jesus of Nazareth could have contemplated the very image with which we started as a way to hold his mind in deep states of concentration during his life in the world, and I will make a case for that. I will touch briefly on Swedenborg's treatment of this vision. And finally, I will have a question for you as to whether or not you believe there is something here for you, something that could be very useful in your own life. But I'll get to that. And I'm reminded, as I wish to pause here, that our lectures coincide so well with each other. Rebecca Esterson's lecture was so interesting in talking about the book of Genesis and that wonderful set of dreams by Joseph. So it illustrates how rich the Hebrew scriptures are in terms of telling deep stories, deeply significant and multi-leveled stories. So with that segue, I move on to say in his book, Jesus, An Intimate Biography, published in the early 2000s, New Testament scholar Bruce Chilton surmises that a young Jesus, that is a young adult Jesus, who would be about 18 years old by our reckoning, might be a little younger in first century Palestine. A young Jesus followed John the Baptist into the wilderness, there to be baptized, immersed, I should say, in the Jordan River, called to repent, followed by a release from sin, a radical teaching at the time. Now, in Chilton's account, and by the way, I should confess that Bruce Chilton is probably within the scholarly consensus of today's view of this Jesus of Nazareth, whom we call the Lord while he lived in the world, that he was Galilean, he was from Galilee, not Judah and Jerusalem, very different places in a very small country, and that he was thoroughly immersed in the rituals, practices, and ideas of his day, which was Judaism, and that the early Jesus movement, particularly while Jesus was alive, was, it could be fair to say, a movement within Judaism. And so this is a culturally apt figure about whom we're speaking, a young rabbi. So in Bruce Chilton's account, and this is an informed surmise, by the way, this intimate biography is quite a bit of surmise. There is no way to know these things from the historical record, although we're getting a lot more information about archaeology today to confirm most of the insights about what Jesus would have been like. And in this account, Jesus would have learned from John's ministry, his public message. And he would have known, as others knew, that this was a new way to think of immersion, repentance, release from sin that was radically different from the practices in the temple in Jerusalem. But he also would have heard John's esoteric message, for perhaps a few. For John taught, in addition to his public teaching, an inner path to contemplation, to bring the Israelite adept inward to the very heart of God. Were this to have been the case, Jesus would have contemplated Ezekiel's vision, for this is what John would have taught in this account. John would have taught Ezekiel's vision of the throne as a thoroughly memorized image to serve as a gate, an inner threshold toward union with God. First century mystical Judaism may support this idea. This view of the inner life of the Lord while he lived in the world, by the way, not only does not contradict Swedenborg's treatment of the glorification, such a practice serves to confirm it. For the purpose of my talk this morning, then, I take Bruce Chilton up on his surmise that Jesus became an adept within John the Baptist's inner circle, that Jesus developed the capacity to hold Ezekiel's vision of the throne in his mind as an established, stable vision for more than moments, an hour, quietly contemplating that image as a way to the heart of God, a way to his inmost level of his being, to experience union with divinity. Now, before going further into this, I'll come back to it. I pause to refer to Swedenborg's treatment, so we're going to take a step back, hold that, and understand just generally what does Swedenborg say about these visions. We've heard something of that this morning already, and I'll just cite similar passages. This one in relation to the most ancient church, an ancient time when people lived with visions of God. They lived in a world where the world spoke to them non-verbally of their intimate relation with one another and with God all as one. Swedenborg writes, members of the most ancient church possessed an intuition and a perception by means of revelations, for they talked with God. They were also taught through visions and dreams, which were supremely delightful and blissful. Now, on Ezekiel's vision, more in particular, quote from Secrets of Heaven, aka Arcana Celestia, 53:13, the Lord is presented in heaven by visual scenes, like those in the various places of the prophets. They come before the people's eyes, as may be seen in the book of Ezekiel, where there's a quote from the text, above the expanse that was above the heads of the cherubim, an appearance like sapphire stone. There was the likeness of a throne, and above the likeness of a throne there was the likeness and appearance of a human being upon it. We read in that section number, sights like this occur constantly in the heavens. All are symbolic. They have their origin in what angels are discussing in the higher heavens. Go figure. They have their origin in those discussions which come down from there and manifest themselves in these visual scenes. The angelic spirits to whom the Lord imparts perception know what these scenes mean. He goes on to say, Swedenborg does, anyone who does not know what these particular descriptions represent or what their consequent spiritual meanings are cannot help but suppose that the Lord has a throne in the way kings of the earth do, and that these things actually do exist there as they are described by the prophets. Though no such phenomena occur in the higher heavens, they are present nonetheless to those in the lowest heaven, within which, as in images, they see otherwise hidden things about divine love. And while that was about the heavens and the highest heavens, the middle heavens and the lowest heavens, I would say for us, reading the Hebrew text at the literal sense of the letter, we see that image that I shared this morning, and that is so we can image something of one like a human being on something like a throne in order to give our minds some way to think about hidden things of divine love. Okay, so here I resume the narrative about our young rabbi, Jesus of Nazareth. We encountered him following John, a radical rabbi teacher in the wilderness on the Jordan River, calling people to repentance, immersion, and you're released from your sins. Very different from what was going on in Jerusalem at the temple. We know that Jesus left John. John was arrested. The Bible account, the gospel account even suggests that Jesus was distancing himself from John. John wondered later in the text of the Gospels who Jesus was. Are you the one for whom we have been waiting? He asks. Jesus famously goes on to say, and what do you see? Do you see the blind receiving sight, the captives being set free? Go tell John what you've seen. So he returns home in this surmise of this scholar. It's plausible. He returns home to Galilee. There's a synagogue there. There may have been a rabbi there, possibly sent from Jerusalem, possibly sent from one of the two schools in Jerusalem. There were two, if I have this right, the general idea is the school of Shammai, which was conservative, of the Pharisees, and the school of Hillel the elder, who was in Jerusalem at the time Jesus was beginning his ministry. Much more liberal in terms of its reception of students and his teaching. It was very much like love your neighbor. So Jesus is practicing perhaps for years as a young man, and I mean years, just a couple, 2, 3 years. He may have been only 14 years old in first century Palestine. That's 18 to 20 in our time, 20th century. He's developed a deep sense of meditation. He's been able to hold the vision of the throne in his mind for long periods of time. Perhaps the rabbi in Nazareth went back to talk to Hillel and say, there's a young adept in Nazareth. He's able to hold his concentration for hours. He speaks well. I think you should pay attention to him. Nothing much happened at that time. That is the kind of scene in this tiny village, rural Galilee, far from the hubbub, if you could call it that, the bustle, the busyness, the violence of Jerusalem. Rome actually wasn't that interested in Galilee. He may have been spared much of that, Jesus and his family, unless until they went to Jerusalem, but they may have only been there for holy days and sacrifice and then came back. We know later that's not the case in Jesus' life. That's later than now. I'm talking about 12 to 15 years before he started his public ministry at the age, as we're told, of 30. He's training, not knowing what he's training for, by the way. He's just an adept, skillful in meditation, which would have been possible in that day. So having said that, I want you to listen, please listen, to Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and to your kindred and go from your country and from your kindred and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Now I pause here to be reminded of Professor Rebecca Esterson's comment that, well, wait a minute, the Hebrew actually might mean go to yourself. First time I've heard that. I said to myself when she said, oh, thank you. For listen to what the text now says. And this is my interpretation of the Latin text. It's quite different from the Standard Edition or from other editions, by the way. It's like Chilton's account, which can only be held to a standard of could have happened, plausible, internally consistent, compelling, historically enough of the, it holds enough water historically so that it's not impossible that it could have happened. This is an interpretation that might be true in its own way. So knowing that Abram in this text is go from your country, from your kindred, from your father's house to the land that I will show you, to yourself. The text follows in Swedenborg's, my interpretation of Swedenborg. This verse and those that follow comprise ancient history. However, the account is now symbolic. Every word pointing to developments in the inner life of Jesus of Nazareth. Here we see Jesus' heart open for the very first time to its interior depth, into a vast ocean of love for the whole human race. The immediate consequence of this was his need to withdraw from his engagement with the religious rituals of Galilee and his community, to step back from the social standing he enjoyed as the result of his achievements, to step back from the teachings of John that he had learned earlier. He was also to let go of the pleasure and the satisfaction that accompanied his involvement in meditation, the holiness and the purity practices, for he enjoyed them. The reason he was going to have to step back was he was going to need all his physical and mental powers to face what was now happening. For Jesus of Nazareth was about to witness an infinite expansion of his love for all human beings, with limitless insight into their inner states and with knowledge of their need for salvation. That's a short section number that begins the story of the glorification as interpreted in the context of this talk this morning. Can you see now how a practice of contemplating an image of the throne over months and years may, as a stable mental image, may have helped to prepare Jesus for this opening, which is infinitely more vast? Come with me for just a moment as we climb a vista to see a bird's eye view of the whole process of glorification as interpreted. By the way, it's interpreted. I think it's plausible. We're going to fly over it. We just read about Jesus' mind opening for the first time. This is the account that occurs within the narrative of Abram and Sarai. I'm going to list the patriarchs in order just for a moment, and then I'm going to refer to chapter numbers just to keep you oriented as to how this story unfolds throughout the book of Genesis, the inner life of Jesus of Nazareth as interpreted by the present speaker. So we've got Abram and Sarai. I skipped to Ishmael, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah and Rachel, and skip to Joseph. I think I got the major figures in there. The first sequence is chapters 12 to 15 in Genesis. Jesus' mind opens, as you've just heard, to an expanse of universal love, as feeling as God feels, seeing as God sees. For in Swedenborg's radical Christology, the inner person of Jesus of Nazareth was uniquely in the Western world divinity itself. God's self was his inner person. He sees like Jesus. He sees like God sees. Right then. This introduced Jesus to the central task of his life, was to join his inmost being, which uniquely was God, and his ordinary Galilean rabbi self. A staggering amount of inner work and outer change would be required. Jesus set out from his relationship to John and his practices in the community of Galilee to see that Genesis in particular told an ancient forgotten story about the gradual rebirth of human beings and of the formation of genuine human community. He knew that divinity was at the heart of his own being in a unique way, and he could see the path he was to follow as outlined in that scripture in Genesis. The first step on the path that lay ahead was a return to a childlike state of innocence, just like a baby. Happy, blissful, joyful, one, just like that. Only now it was his interior life as an adult, still the same person, still the same Galilee, still the same Judah and Jerusalem, still the same person. Now what do I do, he would have thought. So this was, by the way, in the very beginning of Jesus' glorification, is not in this way of reading the birth of his physical self. This is the birth of his interior self for the first time as an adult. It's his second birth about which we are reading and listening. So Jesus, next, this is chapter 16 to 20, saw the vast difference between his vision and the parochial application of the Holy Scriptures within his religious community in Galilee and particularly in Jerusalem. He disputed with others for more depth in their interpretation of the Scriptures and their rituals, for the need to address oppression of his people, not by just Rome, but by the hands of their own king, Herod. He found himself in one argument after another, unable to change the course of prevailing practices. That might sound a little like Ishmael. Chapters 21 to 25, Jesus returned to the practice of contemplation and prayer, reached deeper levels of consciousness in which he realized, deeper level, oneness with all human beings. He got to it fairly early. He became an immensely attractive human being, notable for his charisma and authoritative teaching, his healing, and his prophetic voice. All within Galilee before the beginning of his public ministry, small scale. Others came to him, to whom he introduced an interior attitude in relation to others, love to the neighbor, which was a radical teaching at that time, unheard of, with the resulting renewal of the Judaism of his day within his inner circle. However, Jesus was left with a question he could not yet answer at this time in his life. How was his life and teaching going to fulfill the task that he had been given, namely to save not only his own people, but the whole human race, as we read about that in Swedenborg? That is, the question can be framed like this: how, Jesus wondered, is my own interior development and teaching within this small community of followers going to save the whole human race? His not knowing the answer to this question was a profound and agonizing grief and doubt that Swedenborg calls his most grievous temptation. Chapters 26 to 36, Jesus elaborated the quality and content of his teaching. As the result, he discerned a genuine and deeper love to the neighbor was going to operate within the heart of his followers. He discerned that this was the answer to his previous doubt and the efficacy of his interior life. Their genuine love to the neighbor, grounded in the love of God, along with his ongoing interior transformation, was going to be sufficient for the salvation of the people in his community and the whole world beyond. I qualify that now by saying the whole Western world. Chapters 37 to 50. This realization signaled a moment that Jesus could retreat from his teaching to his disciples and fairly small numbers who heard him. He now knew the answer to his question. It was their contemplation and practice of love to the neighbor that was efficacious. It was going to be transformative. And along with his interior life, which was preceding, and necessary, now he goes deeper. He withdraws from the community. Chapters 37 to 50. This realization signaled the moment that Jesus could retreat, as he had done periodically, from his ministry to others. He entered states of intense study of the Scriptures, prayer, and contemplation to prepare himself for his final journey to Jerusalem. By that time, Jesus had experienced oneness with God and humanity with no sense of separate self. He was ready for what lay ahead. We all know what that is. Well, I promised to say what this means for us, so if we could just kind of take a deep breath. I'm going to climb down off that high mountain where we have just seen the inner life of Jesus as portrayed in this particular way, and ask, as Swedenborg wants us to in section number 3138, what does this mean for us? How can the Lord's glorification and the interior life that it shows, how's that meaningful to us? Aha. Swedenborg writes this: the Lord came into the world. That is, it was his will to be born as a human being, to be instructed as a human being, and to be reborn as a human being. Just as we are, but with this difference, we are reborn by the Lord, whereas Jesus not only regenerated himself, but also glorified himself. That is, made himself divine. And that we are reborn, but by an influx of love to the neighbor and trust in God. From this it may be seen that our regeneration is an image of the glorification of the Lord, or what is the same, that the process of regeneration may be seen as an image, although remotely, of the process of the Lord's glorification. All right. I've got to get to that question that I asked you earlier. I told you I was going to ask you a question, and it is this. Can you imagine going through the states of interior growth and development that correspond, albeit remotely, to those that Jesus of Nazareth went through when he lived in the world? Okay, while you're thinking of that, can you imagine going through similar states of interior development like those that Jesus went through? While you're thinking of your answer, I'm going to summarize those states very briefly with just a word or phrase. I just read them. That was from the high view of vast love. Okay, so here they are. It would be, if we are to imagine this, it would require an opening of an inmost level of being to a feeling, however brief, of vast love, oceanic love, deep love for all people. It would include a return as an adult to a childlike state of innocence, bliss. Might just be in a meditation, might be riding in the car, might be taking a walk in nature, but you have bliss. You're so happy. Childlike. And then you kind of like notice, wait a minute, why is everybody fighting? Because they have the wrong idea. No, and Jesus did this as Ishmael. No, the Torah is not like this. It's about love to the neighbor. It's not about all this, these regulations and these rules. So you might have to go through a little bit of fighting. That's painful. So you return to states of contemplation and meditation. You're going to go back to the beginning. Look, I like the childlike state. And then you begin to hold a transcendent view. It stabilizes. This is Isaac. Aha. A contemplative view works. And I can still be in the world. I can be with people who are arguing. I can even argue with them, but politely. I don't want to end a relationship by an argument. I want to live for another day, to love my neighbor. Okay, so that's transcendence. Then you try it out. You say, I might try to teach some of this. That's Jacob. Jacob is all about, the whole Jacob cycle is all about the followers of Jesus and what they were learning, the reason it goes up and down and all this ins and out, and Laban, and wait a minute, promises, betrayals, lots of people, lots of animals, is because it's not about Jesus' inner life at that point. It's about the followers' inner life, not his. He's stabilized. They're not. And he finally gets through to them. Isaiah, that's when Jacob's name is changed to Israel. Aha, they're getting it. They are kind to one another. They're practicing love. I can leave. Okay, Jesus said. And that's the Joseph cycle, by the way, on an interior level. He's now returning to his studies in Egypt and getting somewhere. Okay, so in this case, you would have then been able to be a teacher trying some of this stuff out. And then the last stage that we've imaged here is Jesus had to really leave. Okay? He really left. We don't really have to leave our lives. At least, well, wait a minute. Yes, we do. But given your chronological age, you may have more time than Jesus had to practice this way of being in the world. All right, so remember, here's your question. Can you imagine going through states of interior growth and development that correspond, albeit remotely, with those that the Lord went through while he lived in the world? Okay, now this is my second time I've asked you this. I said, while you're thinking, I'm going to summarize the states of which I'm speaking. And now I'm going to summarize the talk in 30 seconds, and then it's going to be your turn. I started out with the vision. Don't forget that vision of the throne that Ezekiel had with all the rainbows and the lightning and the big wheels and the eyes and woo! And took you through a historically plausible surmise by a New Testament scholar on Jesus as a young person practicing that. The opening of his interior levels of the mind, as we're told about in the glorification. With Swedenborg's own admonition that our regeneration is an image of that and ought to be. And so is it? I ask you for your answer to the question, can you imagine that? And if you can't, come up with an answer, why not? Or what the obstacles might be. Starting with Susanna, who's holding the mic.
Okay. When you said that part about having that childlike feeling of oneness and love, that I discovered the Swedenborgian Church in 1989 when my youngest son was 2, and by 92 I was in seminary, and partly that was the call was that oceanic feeling of I loved my family so much that what else could I do but love God for giving me that family, and I just couldn't think of anything more important to do with my life than to teach people about Swedenborg, because his writings had meant so much to me.
That is a very good place to start. That is where the Lord started.
Thank you. This is wonderful. I just want to call people's minds to the image in the book of Revelation, and there's 2 riders on the white horses. The first rider comes with a bow and arrow. Our first awakening comes at a distance. It's, oh, look at that teacher over there. Look at that distant thing. And so it's truth launched from somewhere far away. And then there's a second rider on the white horse with the sword coming out of his mouth, with the direct truth, the truth that you can hold in your hand, that you can use directly. So I think as we progress through the epoch of the new church, that at the beginning, and I think this is the difference between Apocalypse Explained and Apocalypse Revealed, because it stops right at that point of the rider with the white horse, where you see something from afar that attracts you. And then there is a point where you come to yourself, where you find that the truth is in your hand, or the truth is something unimaginably intimate. And I invite people to come up to that next step, because I think that's what I feel we're all being called to do, is to make something that's remote or metaphorical or mythological or religious, and make it about, as intimate as breath, as intimate as our own life. And thank you. Wonderful talk.
Okay, good. Marvelous.
Thank you for the vision of Jesus participating in this form of contemplation.
I can't quite.
Oh, thank you for the concept of Jesus being a participant in what we call Merkaba mysticism, or chariot mysticism, which would have been a mode of contemplation of his time, and I'm really enjoying that concept, that he was part of that movement. There's no reason to suspect he wasn't. The piece about his context that I want to challenge, so I want to challenge something you said, which is that the primacy of the love of the neighbor was unheard of.
Okay,
And I'm not sure I heard you right,
okay.
but I'd like to challenge that and actually think a little bit about that context and what the various schools of thought on this verse from Leviticus were at the day.
Okay, so this is a very nice invitation to the 11 o'clock hour, where I think we can really discuss this. So I'm going to give I did not say this in my talk, but I'm going to give my way of understanding this question. In Judaism at the time, and I am an amateur, but I have read in the field, so I speak something like things that could have happened. And there was this figure, Hillel the Elder, who came from Babylon, which was the land of the captivity. He was a scholar, and he taught something different than what had been taught, and he had a following. And that following, as I read his teaching, was love to the neighbor. Love to the neighbor was present in Judaism as a teaching. That's kind of what you're challenging. So we also know that what was present as a culture, as a collective culture, was the practice of sacrifice. That is how you attained pure relation to God. Without the sacrifices, you were an outcast or not part of the community. And there was a holiness code, a purity code, and Jesus followed all those at the beginning, and there was, in this way, a version of it. And there was love to the neighbor. Jesus brought I guess I have to say, a new level within his teaching of a deeper form of love to the neighbor, which did two things. It protected people from the violence of the time, and it began to form a new kind of community at a small scale that was now in apposition to, not opposition, but apposition, meaning it existed at the same time in a different way to the community formed at the temple. And it was transformative, and it was the new idea here for me is that Jesus is in the Lord, while he lived in the world, had to go through these, if we read Swedenborg this way, had to go through these levels of interior development. But very early on in this process, he realized he had to have others go through something similar, but for them it was a more basic form of deeper love to the neighbor, which he found to be transformative. So it was the relationship to the people in a community of practicing love to the neighbor to which I'm bringing attention to, and its transformative potential, more than Hillel could have done. Okay, we still have a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
I'll just answer your question that my answer is yes, that I experience life similarly to the story of Jesus's inner transformation. And I think that's one of the reasons it's ministry and being a Christian is really, really hard, because it's become an institution with particular teachings that then become the teachings that you have to abandon as you go further into the experience of transformation. And so how do we live as a church that's seeking to foster transformation when that transformation is chaotic and unpredictable and often painful and often experienced differently with different human beings? So thank you for your talk.
Very much so. Thank you, Sage. And Evan. Evan might be getting the last word.
I'll make it quick.
No, don't.
Plenty
of
time. Okay. I was just thinking of the Ezekiel vision of the wheel and wondering if it was not during his sleep, and correct me if I'm wrong. No, so it was a vision, not a dream.
Right.
If this sort of was the idea of cementing monotheism, because at its time there was so many polytheism religions around, and that Jesus was, in his radical sect of Judaism, attempting to emphasize the oneness of God.
I think so. I think that's a wonderful insight. Since we are at the end, I'm going to just shift from that idea of the oneness of God to, at that time, in Judaism, as I understand it as an amateur, God was more or less located in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. Well, the temple was destroyed. Now, this is during Ezekiel's time, so this is the first temple, okay, not the second temple, during Jesus' time, which was also destroyed, but after Jesus lived. So the first temple was destroyed when Ezekiel had this vision, and the insight could be drawn, in addition to that, that God could come to us now in the heavens. He doesn't have to be in the temple, which is no more. He's come to our distress. His throne is mobile. Okay, thank you very much. So, discussion at 11. Thank you for coming.